here. It's great to have you here. And it's really awesome to be able to launch, the next 3 weeks. I'll be interviewing or chatting with two esteemed Rabbanim and one Rabbanit. So this week is Rabbi Ben Elton, who really needs no introduction. I think everyone here knows him, but he was appointed chief rabbi or chief minister of the Great Synagogue in 2015. And he's come all the way from Manchester, England, where he was raised, and made a number of observations about the state of Anglo Jewry. He is an expert in many fields, many areas, but especially in history. He has an MA in history from Queen's College, Cambridge, and also he has a PhD in Jewish history as well from the University of London. He also worked in the Ministry of Justice in London, and then studied for a number of years after that in Yeshiva Chovevei Torah. And as part of his training, he undertook residencies as a hospital chaplain, leading a grief support group, and he has a number of smichot as well. And he's written a book, which is always great for, to have that, to be able to share your wisdom. And he's written a book on Britain's chief rabbis and the religious character of Anglo Jewry from 1880 to 1970. So very qualified. Also here in Sydney, he sits on a number of committees, that of Mandelbaum House, Australian Jewish Historical Society, and he's married to Hinda, and they now have 2 children. So Ben, you need to update your website.
No, one and a bump.
Oh, one and a bump. Well, okay, I guess not. That's right, one and a bump. So yes, very, very nice to have you here. Thank you, Ben, for giving us all your time. And today's topic is about it's really that idea is to interview 3 rabbis towards their journey. What made them want to become rabbis, to become inspired towards faith? Especially Ben, he worked in the corporate world or the legal world for a number of years, and then he became inspired and ultimately turned towards chaplaincy and towards the rabbinate. So, kind of what inspired Rabbi Elton to go on that journey and now take up the senior leadership position here in Sydney at the Great Synagogue. So I thought we'll have a great chat, and also significant is the passing of Rabbi Sacks this past week as well. We found out, most of us, on Sunday morning, and Rabbi Sacks was a prolific writer and an incredible mind for our generation. It's a big loss for all of us, and I know a lot of us, as rabbis, we've been chatting and talking and about the huge impact that he's made to us personally as well, not just on the state of world Jewry and beyond. So with that, I want to hand over and perhaps ask a question to Rabbi Elton. Maybe you can start off by telling us a little bit more about your background, growing up in Manchester, what it was like, your family life, your spiritual life, the shul that you attended. Give us a bit of a background.
Thank you. Well, it's very nice to be invited to be at the beginning of this series. Looks like a very good series that's going to come. And always nice to work with my friend Rabbi Friedman. And we enjoy cooperating on all sorts of different ventures, and I hope this will be just another one in a long succession. So my background is, I think, one which would be familiar to many members of the Sunni Jewish community. I was raised in a traditional home, but not a strictly observant home. So my parents were married, in the local Orthodox shul in Manchester, Holy Law, and I think the Sunday after my parents got married, my father walked into the shul office and put down his 4 shillings and 8pence, and took out 2 memberships for my father and for my mother, and they've been members of the same shul ever since. I think in 1977, that's what you did. You got married, you joined a shul. My grandfather was always in his heart a shul goer. He was one of those people who felt he had to work on Shabbos. So for most of his life, he couldn't go to shul on Shabbos morning. But he retired before I was born, when I was little. But I was told, he always said that once he didn't have to work 6 or 7 days a week, he would be going to shul every Shabbos. And so my earliest memories of shul are walking with my grandfather to shul, and then to sitting next to him in shul until the children's service started, which was after the Maftir, I think. That's when we went out to the children's service. And so my grandfather, came from, as many of them did in those days, came from observant stock. I think all my great-grandparents were Shomer Shabbos, and their children, my grandparents' generation, in Manchester at any rate, they felt they had to go and work, so they didn't observe Shabbos, in terms of the prohibition certainly, and in terms of shul attendance. But once my grandfather was able to do so, he returned to shul and went every week until he died. And the tradition in my family when I was little was we lived just a short walk from my grandparents' flat. They had a ground floor flat in a block of flats not far from our family home, and we would walk to their home for Friday night dinner. And then my brother and I would sleep over in the spare bedroom at my grandparents' flat. My parents would go home, and then we would walk with my grandfather to shul on Shabbos morning and sit next to him. And I remember those wonderful discussions about England winning the World Cup in 1966 and United winning the European Cup in 1968. I remember those chats as we walked along Bury Old Road towards Holy Law Shul. And I was surrounded there by people, I was either related to or were sort of quasi uncles. So my grandmother's brother, Uncle Leslie, sat behind us, and my father also sat in the row behind. And when my uncle came to shul, he sat in the same row. And then other people around, I assumed were uncles because they were called Uncle this, Uncle that. It turns out they were no relation at all. But they were the crowd who sat together around my grandfather and great uncle in the shul. On high holidays, everyone dispersed. On high holidays, everyone went back to their own seats because we couldn't all get seats in the same row. But for a regular Shabbos, we could all sit together. I think I'll say a bit about my grandfather, actually. So I also have very strong memories of him doing Jewish things. So for some reason, I must have been there early on a weekday morning. I remember my grandfather putting on tefillin at the dining room table. I also remember my grandfather making kiddush and hamotzi on Friday night before we had Shabbos dinner at his flat with my grandmother. So I have, very strong memories of that. And his father, in fact, had been the sort of shamus or the gabbai of one of the shuls in Manchester before the Second World War, and had led the davening every morning for the people who came to say Kaddish. That was his role. So there were definitely strong Orthodox genes knocking about in the family. His brother, my great uncle Cecil, was actually going to be a rabbi. He went to Manchester Yeshiva, which is a very good yeshiva in those days, and Gateshead Yeshiva, the world famous Gateshead Yeshiva, and was intended to be a rabbi. But the Second World War came along, and he decided he had to join to fight Hitler. And by the time he was discharged, he no longer wanted to be a rabbi, so he went into business. In fact, he and my grandfather were partners in Lewis Brothers, which was their warehouse business. So there were these pretty strong Orthodox and rabbinic genes knocking around. His mother was supposed to come from quite a distinguished rabbinical family in Lithuania. And certainly my family and the whole community really managed, it was pretty Litvish. We were Litvaks, Jews from Lithuania. So not Hasidic. There was Chabad Lubavitch in Manchester, which was had been there for a century or more, became much stronger after the Second World War. But all the mainstream shuls and all the Jews we knew all came from the same sort of Lithuanian stock, like South Africans really, and had that sort of approach. And the Vilna Gaon was always the ultimate rabbinic figure in our community, not Hasidic Rebbes, but the Vilna Gaon was a person who was referred to when it was necessary, when it was appropriate, in sort of awesome tones. So I went to the children's service, and I loved the children's service, and we were involved in the service. One boy would lead Ein Kamocha, another boy would lane like the first Aliyah or the first 4 or 5 Pesukim. Reverend Dr. Joe Jaffe, who was the sort of Chazan Sheni and the Bar Korah of the shul, he used to lead the children's service, and he recorded the first 3 or 4 Pesukim of each parasha for the boys to learn. And I was on that rota, and I learned Vayigash. Vayigash was the first bit of laning I learned, soon coming up, not far from now. I laned from the little Sefer Torah in the base medrash, in the small shul, the first 3 or 4 Pesukim of Vayigash. That's how I sort of first got onto the bimah. And then I sort of had my bar mitzvah, and it was sort of interesting because, I was very involved. You know, I won all the children's service prizes, and I was there every week, and but not from a Shomer Shabbos family. This will come back to Rabbi Sachs ultimately, because my shul, Manchester Holy Law, other mainstream Orthodox shuls like Marubra and the Great, they're not comprised, you know, entirely, even largely of people who are Shomer Shabbos, but everybody is an equal part of the community, and everyone is welcome and celebrated equally, and there isn't a hierarchy in that sense. You know, if you want to be involved, then just like my shul is very keen that you should be involved, so too our shuls in Sydney very keen that you should be involved. And that thing is very, very important, because I think without that, I certainly wouldn't be from today, wouldn't be a rabbi today. Without that solid grounding in a community, in a shul that accepts me for who I was and where I was, and didn't say, well, you can't lay in the children's service because you're not Shomer Shabbos, or you can't lead Ein Kamocha because you're not Shomer Shabbos, or you can't lead Anas Miras on the bimah of the big shul at the end of the service because you're not Shomer Shabbos. There was none of that. And I'm sure that played a huge part in keeping me connected, and ultimately leading me to where I am today. So I had my bar mitzvah. I lay in the whole parasha, which you know, isn't terribly common, but having had this sort of bit of background with laning in the children's service, I felt able to do it. So I laid the whole parasha of Vayis Chanan, which is a lovely parasha with the Ten Commandments, with the Shema. So it was a treat to lay in it. And of course, the famous Haftarah, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, comfort, comfort my people, the first Shabbos after Tisha B'Av. In fact, my bar mitzvah was supposed to be Matas Maseh, which is 2 weeks before. But my closest friend, Jonathan Rosenthal, who's now a long-standing Kollel student in Jerusalem, we were born 3 days apart. So I graciously allowed him to take Matas Maseh, and I waited a week. I waited after Tisha B'Av and took Vayis Chanan.
Ben, just to interrupt for 1 second. Do you think perhaps having that, you know, the parsha and the haftarah kind of gave you that, almost like that mission, Nachamu Ami, like that calling to comfort my people? You were summoned.
Yes, maybe. Well, everything is providential, and it's it has been a calling. So much of what we do as rabbis is comfort,
Yes.
Hopefully I've followed the call of the Navi, of the prophet in my work. So I was bar mitzvah, and then something interesting. 2 things happened which were interesting, really. One is I kind of tailed away. In terms of interest in shul going. So I'd still be, you know, I'd intend to go to shul. My grandfather had died by this point. So I'd intend to go to shul on Shabbos morning. And then I sort of kind of sleep in and dawdle a bit in the morning and this, that, and the other thing. And so I look at the clock and it was already 11 o'clock. So I thought, well, I won't bother this week. Or my 3 great aunts lived near the shul, and I used to go home from shul via their house and make kiddush for them on the way home to my own home. And I would go straight there and just make kiddush for them and then come home rather than go to shul. So there's definitely a period where I wasn't such a regular shul goer. But then my mother came to me one day and she said, Rabbi Chaim Faro, who's a Chabad rabbi in Manchester, is starting a post-bar mitzvah group. And would you like to be a part of it? And there'll be 3 elements to it. On a Wednesday afternoon after school, you will learn Jewish history. No, you will learn Gemara, you'll learn Talmud. And then on a Sunday morning, there'll be a session of Jewish history and a session of Chumash. So I said, no, I don't think this is ready for me. You know, I don't need to give up my Wednesday afternoons and my Sunday mornings. I'm fine. And my mother said, no, go on. It's good. You should know more about your own tradition and your own texts, and you like history. So why don't you try it? So I did try it. And that, I think, was the turning point in my life. If there was a single moment where my life pivoted, it was the decision to go to that post-mitzvah class. Rabbi Faro didn't teach any of the classes, actually. In fact, none of the teachers were Lubavitch. But the 2 most important teachers in those sessions were Rabbi James Kennard, who taught me Talmud and is now the principal of Scopus in Melbourne, and a man who is now called Rabbi Dr. Yehuda Abel, but then was called Mr. Abel, who taught me Chumash. And Mr. Abel, as he then is one of these extraordinary people who, if you're given the first half of a verse, can give you the second half of the verse just without consulting a book, and was an expert on Rashi, on the Book of the Prophets, and we learnt the start of the book of Exodus, of Shemos. We learnt it all the way through, posuk by posuk. We didn't go according to the parish of the week. We just started with the first verse of Shemot, and we worked through. And he brought different commentators, and he sort of impressed upon me not just the beauty, but the sanctity and the status of the Chumash. The Chumash as the word of God, given on Mount Sinai, and not just a text of the ancient world, edited and with different sources. I think my sort of total commitment to that idea comes from Mr. Abel, and just the way he learnt it and taught it and explained it and engaged with it, sort of generated enormous sort of commitment to the idea of the Chumash as our, indispensable foundational text, the communication between God and the Jewish people. And Rai Kennard, in addition to teaching me Talmud, he was a model really of how you could be orthodox and engaged in the modern world. So Rai Kennard could, and probably still can, recite reams of Monty Python. He's a fairly left-wing supporter of the Labour Party. He went to Oxford. He did maths, which I'm not at all sort of gifted in myself. But nevertheless, he showed it was possible to be an Orthodox Jew and be totally engaged in the modern world. Also, he wasn't raised Shomer Shabbos and became so. So also a model, an example of how you can make that journey. So, piece by piece, I put together a sort of observant Orthodox life. My parents were a little worried at the beginning, I think, where I would end up. Would I end up like my friend Jonathan, who became a kollel man in Jerusalem with many children and no television and the whole works, and whose wife works to support him in kollel? Would that happen to me? Would I give up school? Would I give up the idea of university? So once it became clear that wasn't the case, I think they calmed down tremendously. So I became Shabbos observant and observant of kashrus it was always a kosher home, but observant of kashrus in all its details wherever I was.
And Ben, how old were you at this stage? Was this towards the end of your teens?
So this is 14, 15, 16.
Okay, mid-teens.
Yeah, and something I never did, I never rushed it. So I didn't suddenly turn around and say, right, from Tuesday, I'm keeping everything.
Right.
I added elements piece by piece over the course of several years. I think I only started davening 3 times a day, every day, probably during my university years. First it was tefillin every day, then it was full shachris every day, then it was mincha marav every day, and you built piece by piece.
Right.
So, so by the time I went off to university, I certainly considered myself observant, and I started wearing kippah the whole time in university. That was the point at which I adopted the kippah full time, which sort of changes the way you act as well, because if you are identified to others and you identify to yourself as an observant Jew, then that changes the way you do lots of things. I remember, it's a sort of funny example. In the Cambridge colleges have a ball which goes until dawn after exams, the end of the summer term. So it's called a May ball, but it's in June, because in May you're busy with exams. So the May ball is always deferred to June. So I remember it goes till dawn, and it's the summer, so it gets dark very late. So I remember ducking out sort of during the night time after the ball started to go and daven Mariv in my room, and then ducking out towards the end of the ball before the survivors photo was taken to daven Shachris in my room, and then and then I went back. So it was sort of that was definitely something which I prioritized, and at that point was very natural and normal to me. Now I didn't go to yeshiva before university because I don't think I was quite ready for sort of a total and intense Jewish environment at that stage. And in fact, even though I'd studied Talmud for several years, And I carried on learning Talmud at university with a friend who had been to yeshiva, Rabbi Anthony Knopf, who's now a rabbi in Montreal, at Beth Ora in Montreal. So we used to learn Talmud together in Cambridge. And I worked for a couple of years for a member of parliament, but then I did go to yeshiva. After that, I went to yeshiva in Israel to Chapels, Darchei Noam, and learned there for a bit, and then came back and joined the civil service. And I stayed in the civil service for 7 years at that point. You know, I was very involved in my local Jewish community. I was one of the gaboim of my little shul Alei Tzion in Hendon, and I had a chavrusa in Gemara, you know, with a friend of mine, you know, every week, and I went to the shiurim and pursued my PhD in Jewish history, and that was the sort of life I was living. I, you know, bought a flat in Hendon, was, you know, paying a mortgage. I wasn't married, but everything else was sort of on a fairly even keel. Job, you know, shul commitment, other interests, so on and so forth. And I was working there for 7 years in the civil service in London. But as I say, I wasn't married. So when I passed the age of 30, I thought, right, we need to do something about this. So as many people do actually in England, certainly a good clutch of people do, they go to New York. They say, well, I'll go to New York for a bit and see if my luck changes in New York. And my idea was to learn part-time and do historical research part-time. So I arranged to become a visiting scholar at New York University in the afternoons. And there I researched a number of articles and a book, which is still in draft form, which may see the light of day, you know, at some point in the future. And I learned in Yeshivat Chovei Torah in the mornings. And I taught a history class in the afternoon. So it was like, that was my board and lodging. I taught a history class in return for free tuition and in fact a stipend from the yeshiva. And because when I arrived in New York, I basically knew nobody. I had one or two friends in New York, but essentially I knew nobody. And the friends I had, they had jobs and they were working in different parts of New York, not where I was living. I was living in Washington Heights, which is not a very expensive part of Manhattan. Very Jewish, but not very expensive. So I had no real reason to be in Washington Heights for Shabbos. And in fact, the shul I went to and joined immediately because I had this real feeling that, having been a gabbai of a shul in London where people came and didn't join, I was very firm that one should join a shul when you go there regularly. And I was going there every day and sometimes twice a day. But they weren't terribly friendly. It was the shul of choice for all the young people in the area, and there were lots of young people in the area. And so people tended, I think, to sort of disappear into the crowd. And the rabbi was very nice to me, and one or two others, but you know, in general, I didn't feel terribly welcome there. So I thought, well, I don't need to hang around here for no one to talk to me or invite me for a meal. So I asked the yeshiva if the graduates, because it's a really rabbinical school, as much as the yeshiva, which graduates around the country would like me to come and give a talk about Jewish history and help with maybe the davening or something. And, you know, I'll make myself useful and I'll go for Shabbos. And I ended up going to Nashville, Tennessee and New Orleans and, you know, more Birmingham, Alabama and Los Angeles and, you know, nearer places, Brooklyn, parts of Manhattan, as a sort of quasi-scholar in residence. And I saw amazing work being done there by the rabbis, particularly places like Nashville, where you had a really wonderful rabbi still there, Rabbi Saul Strasberg, who, you know, knows his community and loves his community, is connected to his community, and is just building a beautiful kehillah and helping people, looking after people, inspiring people. And I thought to myself, you know, this is a wonderful life. This is a worthwhile way to spend one's career. And also I was loving the learning. I was really enjoying the learning I was receiving in yeshiva, and I could well see doing that for another 3 years. So about halfway or 2/3 of the way through that what became the first year, it was meant to be just 1 year off in New York, then come back to London and continue in the civil service. I only took a 1 year career break, but it became, no, I'm going to stay here, I'm going to change career, I'm going to get smicha, and I'm going to look for a job as a rabbi in a community like Nashville.
So Ben, just to interrupt for 1 second. So what did you find about life in the civil service that was perhaps, what were you missing in that life? What was it unfulfilling? Did you feel like it was a bit empty? What was it?
Well, I think that's a very insightful question. Yes, exactly. I was enjoying many aspects of it. It was oddly enough, people might laugh, but it's actually quite exciting. Certainly some of my jobs were very exciting when I was working for the Lord Chancellor as his private secretary, and you're really in the middle of the political affairs and things people don't know, and it's quite exciting. But it did lack sort of ultimate meaning and ultimate satisfaction. And you're supposed to play a sort of mental trick on yourself. You're meant to say, if you had $100 million in the bank, what would you do? And whatever the answer to that question is, go and do that. Because you can do it even without the $100 million. And for years, I'd said to myself, if I had $100 million in the bank, what would I do? I'd go and I'd be a rabbi who also did historical research as well on the side. But how can I do that? I've got a job, I've got a mortgage, all my friends are here. I can't just up sticks and change my life. I was, the terribly old age of 28. How could I possibly, change the direction of my life and career? But what happened was, that's what I'm doing. What I'm doing now is the answer to that question. And I have been very lucky, and I have been very blessed, and God has looked after me in all sorts of ways to enable me to do what I'm doing now. But that's basically what I'm doing. I'm a rabbi who also does historical research and publishes articles and speaks and writes and so on.
So Ben, do you feel like you're living the dream now?
Well, funnily enough, yes, actually. I mean, I cannot imagine a shul in the world more suited to me than the Great Synagogue. I think it's an extraordinarily good fit. And I can't think of a better place to live than Sydney, especially, during COVID. I mean, how lucky, I sound like the Prime Minister, how lucky are we? But yes. How lucky are we to be here? How lucky am I to be here? How lucky was I to meet my wife? I met Hinda because, I needed, I managed to break even on my time in New York. I didn't actually have to spend any of my savings because I got a job here and a job there. And one such job was as a fellow of the Tikva Fund, which was a year-long fellowship where you were in seminars and you spoke and you wrote and so on and so forth. And I was in the same fellowship cohort as Hinda, and we met and we married. But if I'd not gone, I mean, Hinda is from Connecticut, who came to live in New York and is about 8 years younger than I am. I'm a Mancunian who's living in London. It can only be divine providence that means that I end up marrying Hinda. There can be no other explanation. We were brought together, and I was also very lucky that she was happy to come to Sydney.
Right.
So then, after,
yes. So just going back to, if you can talk now, maybe about the transition from the civil service into the rabbinate. So getting back to that.
Well, actually, there are surprisingly interesting sort of continuities between the civil service and the rabbinate, especially the modern rabbinate. So the old rabbi who sat in his study and they gave a Gemara shir and a sermon once a week, probably not so much. The rabbi is functionary who just sort of carries out his duties and buries the dead and so on. But the rabbi, like I think you and I are rabbis, Rabbi Yossi, where we're thinking about the shul and its strategic direction and its vision, its purpose, and thinking away through problems and round problems. That's all very civil service. That's actually a combination of doing history at university, where you're trying to take large amounts of data and analyze it and distill it and get a coherent sort of understanding of it. And the civil service, where you're saying, right, we have this problem, which might be there are too many people who aren't paying their fines. My first job in the civil service was how to get more people to pay their court fines when they've been, drunk and disorderly, and they'll find £100. How do you get them to pay it? That's the problem. It's also a problem. How do you get more kids to the Purim party? How do you get more adults to Shabbos morning?
How do you get people to pay their membership fees? I mean,
exactly.
You're the expert for that.
How do you get people to join the shul? It's all problem solving, basically, but it's problem solving towards a much, for me at any rate. I think running a country is very important, and a country has to be run well, and that can be very inspiring. People are inspired and very selfless about it in the civil service, but the rabbinate, But the rabbinate, in terms of looking after people and dealing with the matters of ultimate spiritual significance, is of course much more meaningful.
Beautiful. So you really took from all the aspects of your past, from your upbringing, the role model you saw in your own grandfather, and then the role models you had in your teenage years, those two rabbis that you mentioned earlier.
That's right.
I'm
just going to plug in my phone so it doesn't run out of juice.
Yeah, you had the example from home, and then you had these incredible, inspiring teachers as well who role model that behavior, and then you kind of, everything throughout your life kind of geared you to become the rabbi that you were meant to become.
Yes, and I think that part of my hashkafa, part of my sort of approach to Jewish thinking in life is that there's nothing which is valueless. So my moving to a more observant position was never about repudiation of what had come before. Right. It wasn't instead of, it was in addition to.
Right.
So, I still was very interested in politics. I was still, very interested in Monty Python. I was still very interested in hill walking in the Lake District, which was a great passion of mine while I lived in England. All these interests stayed with me. And Cambridge also was very important for that, because there was a whole cohort of people who were also aiming to live a life in both worlds, and didn't feel there was a tension there, but felt there could be a healthy synthesis between the two.
Right. And I think you often see in the professional, the business world as well, you see the people who are high achievers are always those people who kind of find that synthesis between what they choose to be doing at present and their other hobbies or what's come before them in the past. They manage to integrate everything into like a seamless whole, and they can then present their full self and not have to hide or run away from any aspect of their past.
That's right. And I think there's definitely a problem in the way that it's possible to become more observant, is that you hide your past, you're ashamed of your past, and that can be very hurtful to a person's family as well.
Yes.
So there's something to be ashamed of, as opposed to saying, actually, I carry everything I've been and everything that made me what I am, I carry with me. And like any person, you take more and you leave some other parts behind, but everything can add value to who you are and what you can provide. Maybe
just to insert, the Jewish principle of, Zedonot nasa lo kazachiot, that when a Baal Tshuva in a way stands higher than when a tzaddik is, because in a way the Baal Tshuva had those negative experiences that a righteous person, a tzaddik, would never had. But it's almost because they've overcome those challenges and those difficult times or those sins, so to speak, that they may have done in the past. And they've taken the energy that was used and converted it to positivity, because now they're at a new place, which they would not have come to if not for their past. So it's about, I guess, letting go of the guilt and embracing what was, and that's enabled you to be who you are today.
That's right. I mean, I think guilt is the most destructive feeling you can carry with you in life. My view always was.
And why do you think, there's this thing about Jewish guilt, right? And our mothers always putting guilt. Why has that come through in our history as being, the Jewish guilt? Everyone talks about the Jewish guilt. What's behind it?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. Look, we're living in a much less observant age than we were. And I think guilt is the last connection we have to observance. So if I'm not going to do it, at least I should feel guilty that I'm not doing it. So guilt is actually in that sense a positive thing, that it means you've not lost touch with your ideal.
Right.
It testifies to the fact that you're still in touch with your ideal. What I think is destructive is when you carry your guilt along when you have changed, and it's certainly totally destructive to yourself to feel guilty about what you were.
Right.
Whatever you were, it wasn't wicked. It just wasn't, observant. But in any case, a person has moved past that, and they're now living an observant life. And the guilt, if you carry the guilt with you, it makes you insecure. It makes you anxious, anxiety-ridden. It hampers you in your new religious life.
Yes.
So I think it's very, very and it restricts your religious development further. Much better just to let go. I remember, it's not quite the same point, but it's connected. I remember I once came back from a Yom Kippur. I was staying in St. John's Wood because I wanted to be in St. John's Wood Shul, where Rabbi Sachs was in fact gave the sermon for Ne'ilah. And so I was staying with a friend of mine who lived nearby, and he was giving me a ride back to Hendon. And I said to him, how do I know I've been forgiven? You know, I was davening all day, but how do I know at the end I've been forgiven? He said, if you said sorry and you meant it, you've been forgiven. And that's all there is to it. And that's tremendous. It's just a letting go. I remember one year, maybe it was that year, Rabbi Sachs in his sermon for Ne'ilah, he said, we're all carrying around these suitcases filled with bricks of guilt or resentment or regret. You know, we've all got this baggage. He said, just drop it. Just drop the bags. Why are you carrying around these suitcases filled with bricks? Just drop them.
Yes.
You'll feel so much better.
Yes.
And as often was the case, he was right.
Yes. So, I mean, I'm reminded of the story, about the rabbi who bemoans the fact that, once upon a time his community, he always knew that they would drive to shul, but they would park around the corner. But he's bemoaning the fact that now they stop parking around the corner, they park right in front of the shul. So, there's that value of, if you do, as you said earlier, if you feel guilty, at least you know what the right thing is. You have those ideals. You may not be keeping it now, today, but at least you have those ideals. You haven't lost them entirely.
There's also an element of showing covered for the religion and for the shul,
yes,
and for the other people. And a person parks around the corner because they're saying, I respect this institution. And to park outside is really a slap in the face to the shul and everyone in the shul. And there's no need to do that. My personal choices, I've made them for whatever reasons, which might be understandable reasons, but I still know those aren't the principles of the place I'm going. And I'm not going to embarrass other people and myself. I'm going to, I think discretion and sensitivity are sort of underappreciated values these days, where it's more about self-expression. But actually, discretion is a great virtue.
And Ben, I mean, is that a quality that you've seen, growing up in the shuls that you've been a part of? And as you mentioned, you've been through quite a lot of shuls. You were assisting in many. Is that something that that discretion, that the ability to welcome others, non-judgmental? Is this something that you saw and kind of made a choice that's the kind of rabbi I want to be?
Yes, I mean the shuls I chose to be part of shuls where that was the atmosphere. When I was a young guy in my 20s and from and so on, there were choices. You could go to a shul, and I actually did go to a shul for a short period when I was shul searching, where everyone was very from, and everyone there was a sort of demand of a certain standard, and and there was a sort of gatekeeping policy, not exactly stated, but certainly understood, of the sort of people who came here and the sort of people who didn't come here, and I wasn't comfortable there. I don't want to be part of a religious club.
Yes.
I want to be part of the Jewish people.
Yes.
And I think shul should be a microcosm of the Jewish people, where everyone can be there and no one feels this is not a place for me.
Right.
Now that has a price to pay, because it's like being in a monastery or in a yeshiva. Like, if everyone is really passionately pursuing the same objective, you carry each other along, and it means that there's a minyan, every morning without fail, and slichas when you're getting about 6:30 in the morning, you're all there for the start of Ashrei. And I remember one year in Alei Tzion, which was a from shul. It was open and welcoming, but everyone was from, basically. I was davening the first part of the service in Yom Kippur. The place was full. There was not a spare seat on Yom Kippur morning for the first bracha of the day. And it remained that for the rest of the day. And I sat next to a very close friend of mine called Ben Voss, and we sat next to each other for the whole day, and we didn't exchange a word. And we didn't need to, because neither of us wanted to talk in shul. But there was a profound friendship, even in that moment. So when you're in a very sort of uniform environment, the strength of everyone around you carries you through, but you also pay a price. you lose what it means to be part of the Jewish people, to be frank.
Right, right. And then getting back to that, let's call it a life-changing moment. You said you experienced one as a teenager, when you studied your Chumash and with those Rabbi James Kennard and who was the other rabbi you mentioned?
Rabbi Abel.
And Rabbi Abel. And in fact, I was listening, there's been a lot posted over the past few days about, Rabbi Sachs. And there was one thing I saw yesterday, actually, where he was speaking about, like a life-changing moment that he had when he went to visit the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And, as a young man, he went and he was thinking he's going to be asking the Rebbe all these questions. And he was explaining about his work and what he does in the university. And then came one question he was not expecting, which was the Rebbe turned to him and said, putting all that aside, as impressive as it is, what are you doing for the Jewish university students? It became about putting it back on him. How are you going to, connect them with their Judaism? In other words, that responsibility. So you mentioned you had one moment. Was there another moment, or was that the moment where you felt, I have something specific that I can achieve, to leave the civil service, to go into the rabbinate? You obviously had this calling. Was there a similar moment where you felt, I have something specific that I can contribute to the Jewish people, and therefore I want to be a rabbi?
I think there were two moments in my life. One was my path towards full observance when I was sort of 14, and the second was deciding to stay for smicha and change my career, leave the civil service and become a rabbi. When I felt, and the yeshiva was very encouraging in that regard. It said to young men, you have the ability and you have the right human qualities that you can serve the Jewish people. And service to the Jewish people was really the height of the value hierarchy of the yeshiva. The people were in the yeshiva to train themselves to serve the Jewish people. And there was a sense of responsibility. If you can do it, then you've got a responsibility to do it. And so there wasn't overt pressure to stay, but there was a lot of encouragement. And I decided, I can make this work somehow. And God has made sure that it has worked so far. Yeah. So good.
So far, so good. Yeah. And what advice would you, let's say, give to people who are trying to find their own light, who are trying to find, where they belong, where they fit into the world, where they fit into Judaism, based on your own personal story and how you've, come towards faith and taken on this incredible leadership position, which you're doing a fantastic job, may I say so myself, which you're doing really well. So, what would you share with others in terms of who are searching and grappling, maybe now, especially during COVID, where, I know for some people, it's been a time of reflection. They've pulled back from some of their regular duties, or their duties have changed. What would you say to people who are going through those times?
I would say that allow yourself to do as much as you want to do, which is often doing more than you are at the moment. That sometimes you feel, well, I can't do X or Y. I wouldn't fit in if I went to shul on a Wednesday evening, let's say. So, you do want to daven every day, but you think, well, I don't know the people, and they're going to say if I turn up, oh, you're new, and why have you started coming? You're saying Kaddish, and you're going to have to say, no, I'm not saying Kaddish. I want to daven with a million, once a day or once a week. And so all these things hold you back, but really that's what you want to be doing. So anything you want to be doing more Jewishly, just do. And don't worry about, what other people will think or how it's going to change your life, because you'll find your life is richer as a result, and you won't regret it. Yes, you might think, well, if I go to shul every evening for Mincha Mariv, then what will become of X and what will become of Y? You know what? You'll find a way either to fit X or Y into your life, or you'll be happy that you've exchanged shul for X or Y. So that's just a small example. But every step you take forward, you will be pleased you did. And if the will is there, allow that will to be actualized. Don't sit on it. Realize it.
And what if the will is not there? What are you finding now when you speak to people, congregants, those people who, let's say, have not come back to shul, and we're trying to get people now back to shul, or just reaching out to people in general, and asking them, like, have you been engaging with what we've been offering? What can we do more for you? These are some of the questions that I'm asking. And what do you do to engage those people who haven't been engaged over the past year, or perhaps even more? Do you believe that they're actually searching? Are they looking for meaning? Are they looking to become more committed? And
Well,
how can we as rabbis do something about that?
I think you need to have an open door with a big flashing sign above it. You can't really pull people through the door, but you can make sure they know the door is there. And it might be that this month or this year, they're not looking, but the time may come when they are looking, and it might be next year, it might be in 10 years' time. But if they know the door is there and is open, at that point, they'll walk through it.
Beautiful.
So it's constantly reminding people of the opportunities there are, and that they are warmly invited to take part in those opportunities, and hope that some people walk towards you. I've had amazing experiences. You know, I married a couple a few weeks ago. It was sort of COVID wedding, and they'd not been affiliated at all to my shul until that point, and I'm not sure they've been very affiliated in general. The couple. I now learn with the groom every week. Every week we come and learn Torah together, and I say to a lot of people, if you want to learn, you know, and you're in the city, I can learn before Shacharis, or after Shacharis, or lunchtime. Just let me know. And 90% you don't hear from again. But then this chap, we're learning Torah every week for half an hour. It's because the door was open and he knew it was open. He chose to walk through it.
Yes, very nice, beautiful, great perspective. And Ben, should we end off maybe with something, you know, talking about the Jewish people and thinking about the Jewish people as a whole? You know, we're made up of so many different parts, and you know, we're both scholars of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, and we appreciate his works, and obviously given his passing. What can we share, you know, about the entirety of the Jewish people? And I mean, for me personally, that's something that's inspired me, is the fact that, you know, I see myself as perhaps a modern rabbi, but someone, again, who's similar to you, you know, isn't locked into, you know, we don't just welcome one particular kind of Jew into our shul, but we embrace everyone. And how important is it for, you know, us, especially as some of the younger rabbis, to have that non-judgmental, that welcoming personality and perspective? And, you know, what does Rabbi Jonathan Sacks say about that?
Well, I'll give you two quotations from his work, One People, which has had a very powerful effect on me. He says this: in traditional Jewish thought, the bearer of the covenant was Knesset Yisrael, the Jewish people in its totality, past, present, and future. So the Torah was not given to one group or one sect or one generation. It's given to all of us. So every family that comes through the shul's door, every bar and bar mitzvah kid, they are equal bearers of God's covenant, as I am, as any of the rabbi is, as the guy who comes to shul every day is. And it's important to understand the dignity and the status of that person. To use a sort of very traditional term, they're all children of the king, and we have to recognize them as such. And how can you exclude the children of the king from the king's palace? And also, if we're sometimes disappointed or frustrated or anxious about a lack of the extent of somebody's commitment, here's another line from Rabbi Sacks from the same book: those who choose to make a Jewish affirmation in the late 20th century, in whatever form, make a covenantal gesture of heroic proportions. So simply turning up, maybe once a year, maybe once a week, maybe just to their bar mitzvah, but they're making a Jewish affirmation, and that has enormous covenantal significance. They are reaffirming the covenant, and there's a spectrum of intensity you can do that, but they're on the spectrum. They're not off it. Rav Dossi Hoffman talks about making Kiddush on Friday night. There's somebody who doesn't keep Shabbos, but they make Kiddush on Friday night. They've not left Yiddishkeit, as used to be thought about somebody who didn't keep Shabbos. They're affirming Yiddishkeit. For whatever reason, they're not keeping Shabbos, but they are affirming that God is creator and God took them out of Egypt and God gave them the Torah. And we need to understand that and really force ourselves to internalize that when we deal with every one of our congregants or those who pass through our shuls and our communities.
Beautiful. And you know, the concept of Yeridas Hadoros, so that every generation we go away from Sinai, in a way, there's almost like a dilution of the spiritual knowledge and the authenticity, in a way, because we're further and further away. So, you know, I've heard the perspective. It also explains similarly that you know, how much more powerful is one simple deed and act performed today in 2020, even, you know, than 100 years or 1,000 years ago, because we're so far away and yet we're still keeping it. Perhaps it's even more special. And why don't we finish off with Hanukkah? You know, Hanukkah is coming, and it's all about the festival of light, and almost like the theme of today and of the next two sessions as well is about, you know, how do we look inside and embrace our past, you know, our own personal journeys towards light and finding light and embracing who we are, and then be able to share of our light, you know, beyond with others. And I think, you know, you mentioned, you know, the important point that it's, you know, about shame and importance of letting go of some of that baggage and embracing who you are, what your strengths are, what your flaws are, embracing all that, being able to let go and move on. But I'm reminded of, you know, the Chanukiah itself. You know, there's the Shamash. We light all the candles with the Shamash. And there's a story, just to quote the Lubavitcher Rebbe again, where he was asked, I think by, was it Shazar, perhaps had a meeting with the Rebbe. And he asked the Rebbe, you know, what is our function as Jewish leaders? And the Rebbe said, no, what do you think it is? And he said, I think it's to take the candle and to light Jewish souls. That's our job. And so the Rebbe said, you know, I beg to differ. I think our job is to give them the match. You know, their job then is to light their own candle, right? To make it their own and to do it themselves, which I think links nicely to what you said before. As our job as rabbis is that we can't, you know, we can't force anything on anyone, but as long as they know that we're here and, you know, we have bright colors above our doors, we're available, we have lots of things happening, and we'll be here for you as soon as you decide to walk in. So again, that's maybe a Hanukkah message to think about. Anything else, Ben?
Well, I was also reflecting on the Chanukiah, and the Chanukiah in its proper form, when there's no other outside forces, it has to be visible. It has to be seen from the street. It can't be in a place where no one's ever going to see it. Even today, those inside the house need to be able to see it. So we have to, whatever light we have to share, and it has to be visible. Rabbi Sachs again says, non-Jews respect Jews who respect Judaism, and non-Jews are embarrassed by Jews who are embarrassed by Judaism. And it doesn't just go for non-Jews, it goes for Jews as well. Yeah. If we are not dogmatic, but if we are proud and committed and publicly committed, and not sort of scurrying away into the shadows, so this is what we are, this is what we believe, this is what we do, then that will garner respect, and that will spread inspiration.
Beautiful. What a great way to end. Let's be proud of who we are. Well, Ben, we are very proud and lucky to have you in our community, and I personally am proud to have you as a friend and a colleague, and I've really enjoyed having the past hour with you to chat, and thank you for your time. It's been a great honor.
Well, thank you so much.
Great work.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be
spreading
with you.
The light.
Thank you, and Sharon, your wonderful work with ever greater success in Maruba and the Air Force and everything you do. You're an ornament to our community.
Thank you, Ben. Shkoyach.